Not yet.
Well, it's setting it up, but I mean, I hit the title and I hit.
Okay.
There's many steps. Done. Redirecting.
You're going live. We are live.
Nice. All right.
All three of us.
All three of us. All right. Now there's 14 people, so I will let them in.
Awesome.
Hold on a second. And I can let people in. Got 15 people. All right. Exciting.
Cool.
Two more.
So everybody, I guess we could get started. Hi everybody, I'm Bob Surridge, President of Southport Historical Society, and your host for this Second Tuesday Talk presentation. And today, I'm really looking forward to today's presentation. It is Claire McNaught is our speaker, and this is an encore presentation by Claire, and she's going to be talking about Moravian Christmas as practiced in Old Salem. And she did this for us last year, and you're really going to enjoy this. No pressure, Claire.
I'm not feeling it.
It's great. So the program, what you talk about, traditions of the Moravian Church have been incorporated into modern celebrations, and she'll be talking about a lot about the celebrations in Old Salem, and you're going to enjoy it. If you're ready, Claire, you can begin to bring us all that enjoyment I'm talking about.
I'm absolutely ready. And I'd like to get everybody's attention, because when you talk about Moravian traditions, you got to mention food. And food is a big part of all of our Moravian Christmas traditions. And you know, when I did this last year, I was a little frustrated because I had to tell people how to order Moravian Christmas food and where they needed to go to find it. This year, I can send you to 2 local merchants who are now carrying Moravian traditional Christmas goods. Portugal Bistro on House Street and Cat on a Whisk. Both of them are now carrying Dewey's products. So when I talk about all the fabulous Moravian cookies and sugar cake, you'll say, hey, wait a minute, I know where I can go get it. And just like that, you can go and you can have your very own. Now, I always encourage people to buy Moravian baked goods because cooking them is an absolute nightmare. The cookies are so thin that it takes hours to roll them just to a fine place and then bake them. And they come in a multitude of flavors. The traditional one is the ginger spice that I held up, but they're also popular in lemon and black walnut and sugar. And I understand from Susie Farley, who owns Cat on a Whisk, that she's going to have both them and the sugar cake. Now, the sugar cake is a very sweet, high cinnamon, sugar, brown sugar, butter content, but its mystery ingredient is mashed potatoes. And it makes for a very moist bread. And I understand Susie's going to have that as well. Now, I talked to Jake Fold down at Portugal Bistro, and he says he's going to have the cookies and several other Moravian things. He may also have some little Moravian mugs or something. I did find the Moravian stars, which I will be talking about today, in miniature at Mad River. And Gwen Tanner has them, and they're little tiny Moravian stars. And I'll mention those again when I start talking about the stars. But because food is such a big part of Moravian Christmas and Christmas traditions, I thought it was a good place to start. Now, last year when I did it, I was able to give everybody a taste, and boy, you wouldn't believe how well I held their attention after that. So I'm sorry. I hope all of you have great imaginations and can just picture how terrific it would be. But if you're really anxious to try it, you can go shopping in Southport and find it this year. Now, we're going to do some slides, and Liz is going to control the slides for me. And I'll just use them to illustrate my presentation as we go along. But anytime you have something, if you can't see it or you're not hearing me, please let me know. It would be pointless to continue if you aren't enjoying the presentation. So stop me, interrupt me. I'm glad to do it. I like to start out with a little bit about the history of the church because many people are not familiar with Moravians.
Claire, did
And
you
that's probably because we're a small denomination, not because we're a new one. We actually got our start with a prophet who was a philosopher with the University of Prague. His name was John Hus, and it's anglicized to be John. In the original Czech, it was more like Jan Hus. But John Hus was the person who basically got the church started. And it was a reaction to the influence of the Roman Catholic Church in his area. He felt that the church had interfered with access of the congregants to God. And he said people are not living a godly life by the rules of Jesus because they're trying to deal too much with the hierarchy of the church. Now, he's speaking in the early 1400s, so he precedes Luther by over 100 years. He is talking about the elimination of intercessory prayer, and he wants direct contact with God by the congregants. And if there be a single message of the Moravian church that John Hus was developing, it was that we should all be equal in the eyes of God, that we should stand on equal stature. No one should have to talk through a bishop or a priest, but rather directly to God. And his views were very popular and drew a lot of interest, but he was only able to reach the people he could talk to because unlike Luther, he didn't have access to printing press. And many people theorize that had Hus had access to the printing press, that the whole Reformation movement might have occurred much earlier than it did. But Hus's activism drew so much interest from the Pope that the Pope felt he was a threat. And John Hus was burned at the stake in 1415. And I think we can go to the next slide, Liz. And this is the home church. And I'm going to talk about the community that grew up around the home church in Salem. But the traditions of the church were kept alive after Hus's death. And the congregation sort of shrank to about 2,000. And then when Martin Luther came by and he began to draw crowds, the congregation grew, and it was numbered in the area of 200,000. So that was a huge portion of the people active in the Reformation. And he led the Reformation movement with his philosophy, and a man named Albert Comenius took over the leadership of the church and kept it alive. But after Luther, it survived only for a brief period of time, and then the wars that took place started to extinguish the congregation, and they had no safe place to go. And they were identified as the Unitas Fratrum, or the United Brotherhood. And they drew the attention of a man named Nicholas von Zinzendorf. Now, von Zinzendorf was living in the area near Oberammergau in the south, now where they had started. Their initial growth had been up around Czechoslovakia, but now it moved south farther towards Bavaria and Austria. And Zinzendorf said, I want to protect you and give you safe harbor, give you a place to practice your religion. I'm drawn to it, even though I myself am a Lutheran. I like what you're doing and the message that you're sharing. So he gave them a large swath of land where they were able to live and practice freely. And he was so impressed with the way they were stewards of their land that he petitioned to be able to establish a colony in the United States. And he sent the Moravians over to the United States. And the first place they went was a town which I grew up calling Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Well, Bob Surridge tells me that is not the correct name, that if it's pronounced by a Pennsylvania person, it's called Bethlehem. So if you're from Pennsylvania, it's Bethlehem. If you're from Winston-Salem or the rest of North Carolina, we called it Bethlehem. But it and Nazareth were the first two Moravian communities in the United States. And they arrived in about 1735, they arrived. And within about 10 years, the activities in the two communities attract the attention of the Lord proprietors because they're highly successful with their commercial enterprises and with the organization of the community. So they said, the Lord proprietors approached the church and Zinzendorf and said, can we grant you some land in North Carolina for you to settle? So they were given about 100,000 acres in North Carolina to settle. And it was at the intersection of what's called the Three Forks of the Yadkin River, up around Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, in that area. And the brothers became the first to come by wagon road. And for the most part, they walked and carried their belongings, furnishings, and so forth. And they came down to North Carolina with the intent of settling a large community. And the goal was to settle the town of Salem. But they needed a stopping point, and they needed a small short-term residence to live in while they built Salem. So the short-term residence was called Bethabara, and that means, house of passage. And that's all it was. It was meant to be a stopping off point. And let me just pause here briefly and say Bethabara is about 6 miles from the downtown area of Winston-Salem. And a lot of visitors miss going out to Bethabara, but the original buildings done by the first settlers from Pennsylvania are still there. And there are the original churches still there. A number of the houses are there and the areas that they used. And while they were building Salem, they were also attempting to minister to the needs of the Indian population in the area. And they did strike a fairly good balance of being able to do that. But they would go from their homes in Bethabara, walk into Salem, and start the build. The church itself, the one that's on your screen, was not consecrated until 1800. So they were there in the area for almost 40 years before they actually opened their church. The settlement in Bethabara started in about 1753. Within about 11 years, they have moved into Salem, so a few houses are being built, and they started developing the community and then consecrated the church in 1800. And from that point, they have grown. It is a principal church of about 600,000 members in the United States. Around 3/4 of the members of the Moravian Church live in Africa or in the Caribbean because it is a missionary church, and that's where they've taken their word. But I'm going to show you the next picture is a close-up of the door you see in this picture. There you go. And this is a traditional Moravian church with the eyebrow, and it's called the Moravian hood or the Moravian bonnet. It has no value other than architectural appeal. It's an aesthetic. It doesn't serve any particular other purpose, but it is very commonplace. And if you visit Winston-Salem and communities heavily influenced by the Moravian culture, you'll see the eyebrow repeated on the front door or over the garage. It's usually somewhere in the very welcoming space of the house. It's designed to provide some illusion of shelter and comfort. And it also is a good chance to see the wreath that's hung on the front. This is a decoration of the church. And while the principal decorations of the church are inside, the wreath does illustrate a few of the basic concepts. Number one, the Moravians were not inclined to use things like glass and paper in their decorations. They used natural elements, and you'll see the elements of greenery, fruit, nuts, twigs, pine cones, that sort of thing. In nearly all of the decorations they do, interior and exterior. And I'm going to show you another slide. It's with a picture of John Hus, just because he is such an important part of the culture of the church. And it is his concept of egalitarianism that will dictate so many of the other things that you see evolve from the Moravian culture. A lot of how we handle our burials, for example. Liz, the next one's going to be God's Acre. This is the cemetery attached to home church, and it is called God's Acre, as all Moravian cemeteries are called. And you'll notice the stones are flat. This is Huss's message: equal in the eyes of God and man. So he wanted no one to rise above another. He also wanted people to be classified by their gender, their marital status, and their age. So he divided the congregations into what are called choirs, and that does not imply that a person is singing. It is simply the name of the grouping that you got, and you're buried according to the choir as you lived according to the choir. When a child reached the age of about 11 or 12, they would leave their family's home and move into a building that was devoted entirely to single people of their gender. So you might have young men moving into the single brother's house at between 11 and 12, and the young women move into the single women's house. If they never married, they lived their entire life in their choir in that single brother's house. When they did have traditional marriage, they would form a family unit, and we'll go back to that a little bit. But the choir was important because that's how people lived. And it was so important that they took to identifying women by a ribbon on their hats. So you would know to which choir the woman would belong. If she had a red ribbon, she was a young woman not yet available for courting. If she had a pink ribbon, she was single and could be courted. And if she had a white ribbon, it meant that she was a widow. A blue ribbon indicated she was a married woman. So the God's Acre is part of the philosophy of the churches being illustrated, but it also reflects the way they lived. Separated according to choir, which was based on gender, sex, and marital status. So I think we can move to the next one, and that's a very familiar Moravian tradition, is the hanging of the Moravian star. Now, this star originated as a geometry project for the boys' school in Herrenhout. And so if you go out to Brunswick town, they'll show you pictures of this star, and they'll call it the Herrenhout star. Well, we Moravians call it the Moravian star because nobody lived in Herrenhout but other Moravians. So we think of it as our star. And it was something that evolved, like I said, as a geometry project. It's 110 points. And if you decide that you want to have one hanging, and you say, oh, I'll just get the kit and put it together, you will hate yourself by the end of the project, because this is a nightmare to put together. They now come in very easily assembled kits, or you can buy them preset. But they're very commonplace decoration. You'll see them. Actually, I display mine shows year round, because to me it is a symbol of home. And when I see it, I always feel happy and safe, because it reminds me of everything that I grew up with in the Moravian church and Moravian tradition. It is used during the holiday season. And when I first was living in Winston-Salem, people who were not Moravians would ask me if it was appropriate for them to display the star. And I said, absolutely, because that is consistent again with what Hus has asked for everyone. He says, treat us as we are all equal. No one rises above another. No one needs to meet a particular criteria to be accepted into the custom and practices of the church. So irrespective of whether you're Moravian or not, you're welcome to display the star. And it is beautiful. Like I say, I keep mine up year round because it gives me so much comfort, but it's very popular. And again, if you like it, but you don't have a display area, the Mad River is selling little silver ones, which are very pretty. I've seen the star used as earrings, on plates, napkins, welcome mats. It's a very popular sign of the church, and again, originated from a boys' school project. So it's a great little story. The next thing I have on a slide is a photo of our Advent wreath. And this is a wreath, but it's also a calendar, because the stars, or rather the candles, are affixed on each Sunday of Advent. The wreath itself is going to be made of natural elements, and this one is a commercially provided one, so most people make their own, and they may add many more decorations. This is a very simple version, but they will have the wreath set up right after Thanksgiving, and then at the first Sunday in Advent and each Sunday thereafter, one of the candles, and these are the beeswax candles with little red ribbon, which is popular at Love Feast in the church. And I'll tell you a little bit about Love Feast in a minute. But these came into use around the mid 1740s, and they are very popular. Again, not limited to Moravian families, but a Moravian tradition. And that when the candle rather is added to the wreath on the holiday, they will read Bible verses and revisit the meaning of the season. And this is one of the values of celebrating this way, is that it pulls you out of the commercialization of Christmas and puts you back into the spirit of it, because it does reaffirm the whole reason for celebrating this part of the season. Again, they're very popular, and most of them have a little they'll have little decorations like little sheep or houses or angels or stars wedged into it, but they're very pretty, and nearly all of them are done with natural materials. They're not done with the plastic. This is a plastic one, which was commercially sold, but it was an easy photo. Liz, we can go to the next one. This is one that's more typical of what you might see in a family's home where they have gone kind of hog wild. You can see they've got the doves and the ornaments and different decorations added in. The next one, Liz, we can go to the next one, this is the Love Feast. And the Love Feast is a part of the Moravian tradition, but it is not a part of the church services. It was a celebration that started when Count Zinzendorf had hosted a big gathering for the Moravians, and they were praying and reaffirming their commitment to the church, and they just wouldn't leave. And the Count said, I've got to feed these people. So he said, let us all feed them with a sweet bun and coffee. So it became a way of celebrating, especially the love of God, or agape. And that is why the Love Feast is so popular with other churches, because it's not entirely a Moravian theology. It is a recognition of the pure love of God for his people. And when you celebrate a Love Feast, you are celebrating only that aspect of your religious beliefs. So it fits very well. And you see Love Feast being held by Episcopalian, Lutheran, Moravian, and Methodist churches in the Winston-Salem area. And they're very popular. Moravians will give a Love Feast at the drop of a hat, but we certainly have one on Watch Night, Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, and they are celebratory, and people gather. And at the end of the Love Feast, everyone holds up one of the candles to be the light that shines in the world. So they're very moving and emotional. Liz, if you'll show me the next one, I think I've got, this is a plate with the Moravian blessing on it, and it is used to display the food at the Love Feast. And you'll see the Moravian blessing is written out there, come Lord Jesus, our guest to be. And it is centered by the star. And then the Moravian symbol is the sheep holding the Christian flag. You see the candle, and then the little Moravian bow or arch bonnet, architectural feature I told you about at the beginning. And then the next one, I am a very proud Wake Forest Demon Deacon, and I was happy to be there, but Wake Forest is Baptist, or it was at the time I was there. This is their love feast. So I want you to appreciate that while it's a Moravian tradition, it's one that's widely loved by everybody in the community and practiced by churches that aren't Moravian at all. Again, the whole core meaning of this celebration is fellowship and recognition of the pure love of God for his people, the agape celebration. So it is a love feast being held. And this year on December 6th, Wake Forest will live stream their love feast because the COVID restrictions are limiting how many people can actually attend. And of course, COVID is wreaking havoc with everything in Salem. And it's been a real unfortunate thing because there were, at the time I gave this presentation in November of 2019, 90 active buildings in the Moravian community that were open to the public. People could come in and tour them. Many of them were free. There were some that were charged, but because of COVID and the limitations on tourism, a number of buildings are being closed and some are, we expect, going to have to be sold in order to meet operating costs. Over 500,000 people had visited Salem in the year before, and now the numbers have dropped dramatically. Now, a good part of the visit can be conducted outside, so it's still a COVID-safe place to visit, but you can't draw the experience of seeing the inside of the building, seeing how they were built. And the detail is wonderful. You know, when I talk to people who've gone up to Williamsburg and they go, oh, you really need to go up to Williamsburg. They've done such a wonderful job of recreating the community. I say, well, you know, Salem is actually the community. We didn't rebuild it. We refurbished the existing buildings. Now, there are a small number which are rebuilt, but the largest portion of those buildings are the original buildings of the Salem community. It's an extraordinary attraction. It's very accessible to Southport if you'd like to go up and see it. It's only about 3.5-hour drive from here. And it's a beautiful area to visit, and I highly recommend it. I'll keep coming back to that because I'm a real advocate for my town of Winston-Salem, where I lived for so many years. We're going to move to the next one, Liz. Okay, this is the single brother's house. Now, as I mentioned when I showed you the cemetery, the Moravians lived according to their marital status and gender. When a boy was about 12, he would leave his family and he moved into what was called the single brother's house. This is the lone building in Old Salem besides the church, which is still owned by the church. Now, Salem was a theocracy, and when it was originally built, the church owned everything, but it did sell off around 1847 to 1857. It sold off most of the buildings to private holders, so craftsmen bought them or individual families bought them. But this building was retained by the church, and we do allow Old Salem Inc., the tourist attraction, to use it on a regular basis throughout the year. But once a year, we take back a part of it to conduct what we call the candle tea. And this is the way you would start if you were going to candle tea. You would see the greening of the building, which starts around 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Immediately following Thanksgiving, this part of the building will be opened up by the Women's Fellowship of Home Moravian Church, and they will be offering an experience that is a recapturing of tradition. The habit of having decorations and extensive Christmas preparation was starting to fall into disuse in around the 1930s. So the women of the Salem congregation said, if we are to protect our tradition and our heritage, we have to take an aggressive effort. We have to make it a community effort. And so they created what is called candle tea. We do have candles, but there is no tea. It was originally scheduled at what is called the tea hour for eating, and that's how it got the name, but it is not a tea. Tea isn't featured there. And it begins by entering into the single brother's house and recognizing again the value of the natural elements in the decoration. You see the hanging greens, there are going to be nuts. There also usually are a lot of apples, and people kind of curious because apples are not really in season at that point, why the apple is used. And I have been told that what happened is that as the Christian traditions began to develop, they borrowed on some of the early Catholic traditions. And one of those was that December 24th was Adam and Eve's Saints' Day under the Roman Catholic Church calendar. So apples were used as a predominant symbol of that day and were simply incorporated into the Christmas celebrations and now form a significant part of any of the natural decorations that you'll see at the Moravian Church. So we're entering into the Single Brothers house, and the first thing we're going to see is two of the sisters. Now you see the sisters are dressed in their traditional garb. Believe me, these are a pain in the neck to put on because that lacing just never seems to quite work. But you'll look at both of these women are married women, and you can see their little blue ribbons. We're going to see the next slide will be young girls, and you'll see how they're wearing their red ribbons, and their hats are slightly different. Of course, the hats were an expression of style, so they weren't uniform. There are some little differences. And they're demonstrating the beeswax candles with the red paper trim. This was such a popular thing. And just behind them, you can see the Advent wreath is up with the Moravian star decorating it on top. So all of this will be a tradition that people adopted. When we opened the tea in the 1930s, people started coming and saying, this is fabulous. We get a chance to pause, rethink the traditions. And originally only Moravians came. And then other people said, well, that sounds really nice. I'd kind of like to come too. And as time has evolved, there are sometimes a 3-hour wait to get into candle tea. Now the price is steep. It's $2 a head. So everybody that comes, except children, we charge children $1. We use 100% of what we raise goes to the mission effort. So it's not a sweep of greed. It's just a test to see how enthusiastic you are. If you're willing to cough up the $2, we're willing to give you an experience that really makes Christmas come alive. And as it has evolved, we now have generations of people. And when I'm working the tea, if I'm coming in for my shift, sometimes I'll see the line way back and it's grandma and ma and the babies, and they're all coming. As you do your narration in the tea, it's not uncommon to have people in the crowd say, hey, you left out X or Y, because they've been coming for so long. They know everything you're going to say. But what it is a reaffirmation of Christmas. It's a reaffirmation of tradition and the value and beauty of the things that are the core of the Moravian community in Salem. So it's a really wonderful experience. And as people walk in, the first things they start to be aware of are the smell of the coffee and the smell of the beeswax candles. And then the next slide. This is the saal. This is a living area where the brothers would gather. And what we do is bring people in and we sing some carols, and people get really in the mood. And the organ that's used, you can't get a really good clear image of it from this picture, but it's very old. And we have a couple of sisters who can play it quite well. And people sing the traditional Christmas hymns that you would have heard in virtually any Protestant church, O Little Town of Bethlehem or Silent Night. But we also sing some traditional Moravian hymns. And the Moravians are, their German heritage really shows up in the hymns and the music. It's heavy in brass, but probably the most common of the Moravian hymns is Morning Star. And that's usually part of the process. And people are now, by the time they've gotten here, they're getting a little tired. They've been in line maybe 2.5 or 3 hours, and they're ready to relax a little. So they sit down and they sing. And then to really win their hearts over, we take them downstairs and introduce them to our Moravian coffee and our Moravian sugar cake. And we serve the coffee in the mugs. And quite frankly, this stuff, don't drink it if you're not ready to stay up all night. The recipe calls for 3 pounds of coffee and 4 pounds of sugar. And believe me, you feel every grain of that sugar. The energy level is just phenomenal. But we serve the sugar cake. Now, sugar cake's pretty expensive, but we do serve it at Candle Tea because it is the essence of Christmas and people love it. Now, what you're looking at is part of the kitchen. You can see the stove oven area behind him. You can even see the little toaster. Right behind the light is the toaster that was used. They would slide the bread between those arches and then toast it over the open fire. So it's a really fun room to be in as the sister who does the narration. And I always enjoy being there on cold days. Now, if it were like it is today, I'd far rather be in the basement because that's where they hung the meat and kept the cooling natural. But the kitchen is a very popular room and everybody relaxes. And then from the kitchen, they go next. Achoo, Liz. They go next. I want to show you this sister. She's now 96. She wasn't 96 in this picture, but she's the kitchen steward in this. Her name is Fran Hutter, and she's been active in the church since her childhood. And that's really one of the nice things about being a Moravian in Salem is that there are generations of family members there. I stand in the same place my grandmother stood, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, and I always feel their presence with me when I'm working at Candle Tea. And I shouldn't even call it working because it's such a place of joy. You just have so much fun doing it because it is nothing but pure love and pure fun. It's not designed to make you think of, oh my gosh, what have I got to do? My list of Christmas of things to do is so long. What you do is just immerse yourself in the idea of Christmas and the celebration of Christmas. By this point, people have now eaten and they go in and buy, I think the next slide's going to be some candles. Here are the candles for sale. And again, you can see the little Advent wreath in the back, and that's how the candles are used. But they're also going to be used in all the love feasts because everyone holds them and the paper is designed to keep the wax from burning their hands. Because the first people to use the candles in love feast were children. So of course the church is devoted to the protection of the children, and they designed it so that it would be safe for the kids to hold. And I think the next picture, Liz. Ah, good. This is the Putz. Now, Putz is a German word which means decoration. And it was something that each family had in their home. They would have a little, it might be a nativity scene or it might be a pastoral scene. And in the 30s, they realized their busy lives were consuming them and they weren't bringing the Putz out because it was just too much trouble to get down all the sheep and all the, oh, no, I can't do it. And again, when the ladies realized that they were losing their tradition, they said, we need to take the community and make a community Putz so that the burden doesn't fall entirely on individual families for a Putz. Back in the old days, everybody competed and they wanted their Putz to be the best. And on Christmas Eve, people would go out and they would go putzing, which meant you went from house to house to look at everybody else's Putz and see how it had been decorated. But because of the busy lives people were leading, the community Putz seemed like a good idea. So the congregation committed itself to constructing a model of Salem. Now, what you're looking at is not how Salem would look if you visited today. It would have looked like this roughly the mid 1800s, maybe 1840, 1845. The first thing that you would notice that isn't there, that is in on the Putz, is those trees. And the reason the trees aren't there is that in May of 1989, we had what some people called a microburst, some people called it a tornado. Whatever it was, it had a lot of wind and it took out all those trees. But the rest of it, most of the buildings are still standing. And the building over on the far left side of your screen is the Single Brothers house. And next door to that is part of the outbuildings for it. Across the street on the corner is the little boys' school. That's where the boys went to school. And this illustrates as much as anything one of the fundamentals of the Moravian creed, which is you educate the women as you do the men. So while the brothers and the boys were being educated in the single brothers' house and the single boys' school, across the way, you look at 3 buildings, the one with the columns in front of it and the 2 immediately to the right of that. And those are the core buildings of Salem College and Academy, which is the longest continuously operating educational institution for women in the United States. Now, many churches had schooling for the girls in domestic arts. They might teach them things like sewing or cooking. We did certainly have that in the Moravian community as well. But in addition, the girls were taught Greek, Roman, Latin. They learned languages, they learned to write, they learned to read, they learned science, mathematics, and value was placed on how well a woman was educated. It was an extraordinary commitment by the community. It was a luxury that the Moravians were among the few to enjoy. Women were not seen entirely as a workhorse to make sure that the food was served or that the house was kept clean, but also they were recognized as an important part of the community to contribute to the culture of the community, the art of the community. So it's something I value when I talk about it. The little tiny building that's kind of in the center square is the fire station, because they did have a community fire department and it ran right out of there. And just immediately to the right of that, you'll see the old water pump, which was used, and it's still standing, but people would come up there and pump water. But the great thing about this community is they figured out how to have indoor plumbing. Now, they didn't waste it on bathrooms. They used it for kitchens, but they developed piping that led from the springs into the buildings. And this is one of the first places that indoor plumbing was used. And when George Washington came to stay at Salem, he stayed 2 nights because he got so fascinated with what was going on in this community. Now, you can see their German discipline in the way the buildings were built, and it's all very planned. Everything was calculated. Nothing is random. It was all very carefully calculated, very carefully documented. The archives of the Moravian Church contain such detail that when we have a small problem, there might be a missing corner or something to a building, we know exactly what it was supposed to look like because the documents of the church recorded it so thoroughly. And remember, everything was owned by the church. So the church, it was a complete theocracy until about 1847. About that point, private ownership takes over. But up until then, the church owned it all and controlled everything. The putz is done to HO scale. It's made of balsa wood. It's all handmade. And the little trees, I love the trees because they're actually different. We have elm and we have oak and we have pine, and they're made by taking electric wire and fraying it in such a way that it creates the image of the tree depicted. So it's not just fun to look at. It's magical. It's really large. We put in the snow because we wanted to make it feel like Christmas. Originally, we used flour, but that had a downside, and we had little footprints in the snow every morning. So we decided to switch to marble dust. So we put marble dust in a popcorn popper and shake it out over the entire putz. And it's quite large. But I love being down in this room with the kids when they first come in and see it, because they're so accustomed to much more glitzy, sophisticated things. This is a very basic plain, but they see the magic immediately. And when children walk in, you know that you're building that tradition, and it's going to be another generation of people who come back to celebrate. When they leave the putz, they go to the last room of candle tea. And of course, it is our most important room. In this room, we feature these hand-carved figures that were brought back from Oberammergau, Germany in about 1952 by one of the members of the congregation. The sister who is assigned to this room is privileged to recite the story. Some of my sisters can actually sing it from Matthew of the birth of Christ and the arrival of the wise men. It is so solemn and so affecting. You could hear a pin drop in this room, even if people have been talking a lot in the puts or talking during the celebration in the kitchen or whatever, they grow silent here. And it is a pause and a moment of reflection. And I love to see the joy and emotion in people's faces. And nearly always we see tears because people really focus on why the celebration exists. There is no aspect to this other than the pure faith. And it's beautiful, inspiring, and I always like being in there, but I never sing it. No one wants to hear me sing the little town of Bethlehem, which is how we close it. But that is the candle tea. It runs the first 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. And of course, this year, we're not going to be able to do it, but they will try to adapt with some virtual programs. But in the future, if you have an opportunity to go to Salem, this is worth the trip and certainly something you should plan to do. Now, I don't have a picture of a Christmas tree, but I want to mention them because they are a Moravian tradition as well. They had appeared in Germany and primarily Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, that area, in the early 1700s. The Moravian tradition has it that in about 1300, St. Boniface was walking in the woods near the time to celebrate the birth of Christ, and he came upon a group of pagans who were getting ready to commit a live sacrifice of a human being. And St. Boniface was horrified. They were going to hang someone from an oak. And he was so angered by the display that he smote the oak, dropped it to the ground. The pagans were so struck by his power that they immediately became Christian. And he said, in the future, I want you to celebrate with a fir tree and with gifts and bring joy. So there is a chance that that story influenced the evolution of the tree as a part of the Christmas decoration. But it appears in common use by the 1700s in Europe, but not yet in the United States. And unfortunately, like most record keepers, if something's very ordinary, it's not noted. If something's extraordinary, it is noted. So we don't know exactly when they started showing them, but the earliest documented evidence of them comes in the Moravian community in the mid-1700s in Georgia. We had a sister who was assigned to mission to the Cherokee Indians. And she was in Georgia and she brought in a small tree as part of her decoration. And that's mentioned in the notation. When it comes up in our first official record, it's a record of an embarrassing incident where apparently people got into a fight over who owned a tree. Seems one guy had been looking at it as his special tree and had been taking care of it all year long and had intended for it to be in his house. And some other guy comes in the night before Christmas and just cuts it down and takes it to his own house. And it infuriated the church. And typically when people in the church were infuriated, the object of the irritation was frolicking. They didn't like frolicking at all. Frolicking was a no-no. But here it's actually selfishness. Someone has taken someone else's tree and used it. So as early as the 1750s, you find evidence that the tree is in common use in the Moravian community. And it, of course, has become much more popularized. I like the idea that St. Boniface got it started, but I have a sense that it was more just German tradition that brought it along. And the other aspect of it is that the fir trees, which were commonly used, were also a popular shape that was used in a lot of the decorations adapted by the Moravian community. The pyramid shape, it was designed to reflect the hierarchy of the world. And many people think that the pyramid shape just had a particular attraction to them, and they probably incorporated the pyramid in the decoration by adding a tree because it reflected it. A combination of factors probably went into the bringing of the tree into the church. But I know a lot of people talk about Christmas as the big holiday, but in the Moravian church, the fact is that the bigger holiday is Easter. And I want to mention it because if you do go to Winston-Salem to bear witness to any of the displays, you should know about the Moravian Easter. It is the largest sunrise service in the world, and it has been held for many years. How COVID will affect it this year remains to be seen. When I lived in Winston-Salem, I was the attorney for the police department, and they dreaded it because we would get 70, 80,000 people come in for this service. It was horrible. We had no parking, and people, of course, are trying to park at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it could be a real nightmare for police. But for everybody else, this was fantastic. Music is a huge element of all Moravian tradition, and our music is antiphonal, which means that we played one band to another. So when I was a kid, my dad was a lifer in the 82nd Airborne, so we didn't live in Winston-Salem, but we would come in and out of it to visit my grandparents and great-grandparents. And on the night before major celebrations, Christmas Eve and Easter, the antiphonal bands of the Moravian Church would go around the community, and they would position themselves on different corners, and they would play to one another. So if you are a person who grew up in Winston-Salem, this is one of your earliest memories. And the simple sound of a Moravian band playing, because it's very heavily weighted with brass, will trigger all your memories of your childhood, because it was one of the most singular parts of the experience. The bands were out there to call you to worship, and they would start around midnight, and they would march around town and position themselves so that they always were able to play to another band. So it's the original battle of the bands as they back and forth between them. Then at the end on Easter, as at the end on Christmas, they gather at the church. In Easter, everyone gathers down at God's Acre, the cemetery. All the bands come from all over town and meet. And then they have a service. It's not a sermon. It's more reading of scripture, and it's liturgical. It's not a service. So we get a lot of people who come to the church who are not Moravian and who enjoy the services, because there are no limits on who can be included. If you want to join a love feast or candle tea or Easter celebration or anything, there's nothing that says you have to be a member of the church. It is an egalitarian, open church designed to give everyone an opportunity to be a part of it. I'm getting very close to the end, but I want to talk about Santa Claus, because he's not an entirely Christmas tradition from the Moravians, but he does appear to have been very popular among the Moravians, and they were one of the core groups using him. That's just another picture of Easter sunrise. There were two figures. There was Kris Kringle, who rewarded good little boys and girls, and his emergence in the history of the Germans, it goes back well into the 1600s. You have evidence of Kris Kringle. But there was a less popular guy, and he was used by the Moravians. And I cannot believe my parents passed up the opportunity to threaten me with this guy. But his name was Belschnickel, and he was ugly. His nose touched his chin, and he wore filthy clothing, and he came bearing switches. And he would come in on Christmas Eve, slam open the door to the house, stomp in and demand to be given all the bad children. I can just see my mom and dad saying, this is our chance. But they never did this to me. And I'm so grateful, because I think I would have been scarred for life by Bell Snickle. This guy was awful. And he was then replaced when Bell Snickle would be sent away because there were no bad children. Chris Kringle would come and he would bring the gifts. And what Kamemia said was, parents ought to be especially careful never to allow their children to be without delights, for the joy of the heart is the very life spring of man. So gifts are a traditional element of Christmas tradition in the Moravian Church, as is Chris Kringle. And while I was doing my background checks on this, I learned about a similar personality to the Belschnickel character who was in Wilmington. And his name was John Coney. And I had never heard of this guy before, but apparently the slaves who came in from the Caribbean had John Coney, who dressed similarly to Belschnickel. He'd have on the long black robes and the colorful stuff hanging off of it and the ugly face mask and everything. John Coney would go around, and it was the slaves, and they were allowed off on Christmas Eve. They would go around Wilmington and sing and dance and ask for treats. John Coney, if you've ever been to the Bahamas during a holiday celebration and heard about Junkanoo, John Coney, when you see the names written out, John Coney and Junkanoo, or the Goombay dancers in Panama, and not Panama, but Bermuda and Barbados, very similar in appearance to the costuming that Belschnickel wore. So apparently the character and the idea of the character, somebody coming out looking for the bad children, entertaining, and it was all in fun, of course, but it must have been awful. I can't imagine a 6-year-old opening the door to this Belschnickel guy. It would have done me in. At any rate, it was incorporated in the history of the Cape Fear region. And I thought, well, that's a great little connector. That pretty much covers all of what I was going to cover today. And I'm watching a clock, and I can see I'm approaching my full hour, but I'm certainly open to taking any questions if anybody has any. I would like to say just emphatically, if you get the opportunity to go to Winston-Salem during the holiday season, it's wonderful. A lot of people just stop on their way to Biltmore, which is also fabulous. I highly recommend Biltmore at Easter, our Christmas rather, is a wonderful time. But do stop in Old Salem and visit Bethania, Bethabara, that area, and see it all, because it's the original stuff. It's real. Any questions? Then I guess it's okay for me to exhale.
Claire, that was excellent. I heard it last year, and it was just as fascinating to hear it this year. I think I learned more things. It was really, really well done.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
I have to tell you that I have experienced going to the sea at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We went there for the holiday, really to see the Bethlehem Hotel, which is historical. And we happened upon the Moravian church. We walked in, we were given the candle, and we sang traditional Christmas carols. It was absolutely marvelous. So enjoyed the service. We've never forgotten it.
Isn't it wonderful?
Yes. Yes.
It just makes my heart fill to hear people, because so many people see no other Christmas except the highly commercialized version, and they're getting pretty jaded. And seeing it at its basic, simple essence is so joyous.
Yes, yes. We saw the puts there. They had that set up. People were going by. It was very, very nice. Very, very nice. Are they something like Mennonite? Is there any connection to Mennonite?
No,
Nothing.
we're far closer to Methodist.
Okay.
It's very egalitarian, but we've gotten rid of all the choir distinctions like that, and we no longer marry by lot, which we used to have to do. You know, you'd have to draw a lot and see who you were going to get stuck with for life.
Oh God.
Yeah, can you even imagine? You thought online dating was weird. Can you imagine the lot? But we're very similar to Methodist, and you'll see a lot of overlap. If the Methodist minister knows that the Moravian minister is unavailable because of illness or something, he'll step in and help out. It's not at all uncommon.
Mhm.
In fact, John Wesley was in Georgia, sailing into Georgia during a heavy storm, and the people on the ship with him were Moravians. And he said, I am so fascinated by them because of their confidence in their safety. Their calm confidence inspires me. And Wesley often attended Moravian gatherings when he returned to London.
Claire is fantastic again.
Thank you.
It's great.
Glad to do it.
Thanks, Claire. Enjoyed it just as much this year.
Thank you. I'm surprised everybody's saying they liked it as much without the cookies.
Well, it wasn't quite as tasty, but it
Yeah.
was good.
Okay, before everybody goes, let me just tell you what's coming up. If you mark November 16th, 17th, and the 19th, kind of finish off November. November 16th is the Monday, November 16th at 7 p.m. will be Southport storytelling with Southport storyteller Mike Royal. And Mike will be sharing a story about his time as a kid looking for someone to play baseball with. And I think you'll be surprised at who he found to play baseball with. Tuesday, November 17th at 1 o'clock, Liz Fuller is going to talk about Hurricane Hazel. And right in time at the conclusion of the hurricane season. So I hope you're not going to bring a hurricane, but just tell us about Hurricane
I don't
Hazel.
think it's bad luck to just mention it. I think we're
Hurricane Hazel made landfall here in Southport, but if you're of the right age and you lived on the East Coast, as I did in northeastern Pennsylvania, I mean, Hurricane Hazel was huge in northeastern Pennsylvania. So it's interesting that it started down here in Southport. Interesting to me, and ended in Canada, by the way. On Thursday, the 19th, is what the society calls a general meeting, and this meeting has a speaker, and that's on the 19th. It starts at 6:30 in the evening. Speaker, actually two speakers. The first one is Norma Eckert, and she'll be talking about the Fort Caswell rifle range, and also introducing you to the books that she just completed, titled Brunswick County in the Great War. And the other guest will be Leslie Randall Morton. Leslie was an intern with us at the society, and she's now the director of the Bellamy Mansion in Wilmington. And the Bellamy has opened up again. And so I'm asking Leslie to share some of the challenges of reopening a museum, as we're looking to do in 2021, but reopening a museum in the age of COVID. So I think you'll find both of those folks really interesting. December 8th, the second Tuesday talk, the Desiree Bridge. Desiree is one of our board members. You'll enjoy Desiree. She's going to be talking about doing Christmas dinner during World War II. And that of course you had to be a little bit more creative because of the rationing of different foodstuffs such as sugar. And then December 12th is the December program of the Southport storytelling, again with Mike Royal. Did I forget anything, Liz?
Yes, December 1st, Pat Kirkman will be doing Living Voices of the past, and she'll be portraying Kate Stewart and then telling some about her life. So that will be a very fun and exciting presentation.
And December 12th, we'll be doing our part, which of Southport's. I can't think of what I can't think of this.
Winterfest.
Winterfest. Thank you. Of Southport's Winterfest, and we're going to be doing a session on old-fashioned Southport Christmas. And I think you're really going to enjoy that. It's coming together really nicely. And so I hope you'll participate in that. And that's Saturday, December 12th. And it will start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Any other questions for Claire? All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for helping. Thanks for participating.
See you next week.
We could cut the live off now.
Oh, thank you.